Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture on psychopharmacology. And this is just the introductory lecture. So as I said in the syllabus introduction, these little mini lectures are just a little bit of information that highlights some things from the chapter. All of these mini lectures don't cover everything that are material that you need to know from the textbook, but it does get you started thinking about the material. And please do not hesitate if you want me to add more things or do a little mini lecture on a particular topic. I'm happy to do that. So just let me know how things are going. And if you prefer to watch more lectures, I can always make more of them. Okay, so psychopharmacology. A lot of times students will come to class and they'll think about, oh, well, this is a class about substance abuse problems. And that must be something that only humans have, struggled with. But the reality is, what we're talking about are the use of psychoactive drugs that change the way you think and feel. And that's true for animals as well as humans. And humans have realized that plants have actions. So if you ingest a particular plant, you might feel differently. And so humans have used things that are considered drugs for thousands of years. And this course will talk about where those early origins are. So chewing the coca leaves from the coca plant, that was going on for thousands of years. And even though today maybe people would use powdered forms of cocaine, which is more purified. Animals are very familiar with alcohol because alcohol happens in nature by the process of fermentation. So I grew up in Canada, and every year we always had like a news story about a moose who ate some apples that had been on a tree, and they had got yeast on it, and the apple had fermented, and so then the moose was walking around intoxicated, and so there was always these sorts of stories that happen, and it does happen in nature. So the pen-tailed tree shrew is this little animal on the left side of the screen, and it lives in Malaysia. It's actually a huge alcohol consumer. They will consume many standard drinks per day by consuming products in the food source that contain alcohol. Interestingly, they might have 7 standard drinks a day or more, but they don't actually have hangovers. And so they have gotten used to ingesting so much alcohol. Animals wouldn't consume alcohol all day long every day because, as you know, in nature, you would be prone to succumb to a good predator coming by, seeing you intoxicated. So it doesn't happen all the time. But certainly, it's not just humans that have used drugs in various forms. And in fact, primates, if you look at the picture on the right, they have been used quite a bit for studying the use of drugs because they are like humans in that, for example, if you offer alcohol, some primates will drink very little at all. Some will drink so much. They are drinking so much every day. They're getting intoxicated all the time. And then some are more moderate drinkers. That sounds a lot like humans, right? So, we have some people who don't drink at all. They really don't find it, appealing or interesting. We have some people who have problems with it, and then a lot of people in the middle. So studying animals can be a great way to understand the effects of drugs for a lot of different reasons. So we'll often refer to that in the course. And a lot of times these animal studies will be in controlled laboratory settings. So we have a lot more control over the findings. Okay, so really, psychopharmacology, what are we talking about? We're talking about the scientific study of drugs and how they affect behavior. So this is the combination of the field of psychology and the field of pharmacology. And because this is about drugs going into our bodies, into the brain, changing how we think and feel and respond, there is a component that is very much the pharmacology piece, the neuroscience piece, and then there's the piece that is the psychology, sociology piece, because the effects of drugs are also about how social and environmental factors influence drug use. And those can be incredibly important. What is the definition of a drug? The World Health Organization defines a drug is a chemical that alters biological function and possibly structure. This definition has been used since 1981 and hasn't really changed. And when we talk about the drug, obviously we take in lots of drugs that don't alter how we think and feel. So in this course, we're going to focus on the drugs that alter mood, alter cognition, or how we think about things, our mental processes. They change our behavior. Those are the psychoactive drugs. Those are the ones that we're going to pay attention to. So when people ingest drugs, the obvious question is why? Why are people taking drugs in any form? And a lot of times it falls into these four categories. There's that they feel good. They feel much better when they ingest that drug compared to a baseline state where they weren't using it. And it can be very mild, like a mild pleasure sensation to an extreme change where you feel very high, very euphoric. So that's one of the reasons that motivates people to use drugs. The second is that they want to feel better. Mood is improved. Maybe they feel a little depressed or very depressed and they're using drugs to mitigate that. Maybe they have a lot of anxiety and so they find that the drug that they're using reduces that anxiety. So there's that motivation. Then there's also to do better. Sometimes you want to perform better at a sport or on a test. So some stimulant drugs are used for this reason. And at the very last chapter of this course, we're going to talk about this category of motivation of use and what drugs are used in this way. And then there are other reasons, sometimes it's just curiosity. People are bored. Boredom is a huge factor that a lot of people who go into treatment for substance abuse, they will often say, I'm just so bored. I don't have anything else to do. And so, that boredom can lead them to seek experiences with drugs. It can be also reasons like wanting to fit in or peer influences. The typical example, of course, is like an adolescent who's around others who are smoking or drinking. And, maybe they're really not that interested in using, but they use because they don't want to stand out. And so that can be a factor. And interestingly, these changes, these different categories will change depending on how the use is occurring. So maybe initially an adolescent might just drink alcohol because they want to fit in or they're curious about what the effects are. Nothing really much more than that. And over time, if they use alcohol repeatedly over and over and over again, they may find that it reduces their anxiety. Like maybe somebody who has a lot of social anxiety will use alcohol to reduce their anxiety in social situations, and they feel like it helps them. And then they become overly reliant on it so that they actually can't really function very well without the help of that substance, which can lead to problems. So as you can probably imagine, in many cases, the why of people using drugs may change over time. And, that may dictate whether someone becomes just a casual user or actually develops some serious problems with this substance. Okay, so how much is too much? When does use become abuse? We'll talk about this in every chapter for each drug and what things we're looking at. And so this is something that the field grapples with. We will, for example, in the alcohol chapter, talk about, what if scientists determined is probably a safe level of alcohol consumption? And, does it differ from person to person? Does it differ from circumstance to circumstance? All those sorts of things. That's very important because many people use these drugs and they will oftentimes not have any problems with them. They can easily stop. And yet another person who might use the similar amount may suddenly be really struggling with stopping use. So definitely a good question. And one of the things you think about when you think about the drug experience is what is playing a role. And it really falls into two things. The first thing is the pharmacological factors. The drug is going into the body system and changing biochemistry and physiology. The actions in the body may be different. So, you ingest a drug like cocaine, your dopamine levels will rise because of the use of the drug. And so you feel better, more euphoric. Okay, so the drug itself will change that. And we know those pharmacological factors are changing because we can study humans, we can study animals, and we know these things are changing when the drug comes into the body system. And then there's the non-pharmacological factors, which historically, if you talk to scientists decades ago, they may have thought, oh, those things don't really matter very much. Not really all that important, but the non-pharmacological factors are incredibly important. So it's all the things that are not directly related to the pharmacological action of the drug. So for example, the experience that you have with ingestion of cocaine would be very different if you live in poverty, if you have no other opportunities, as opposed to, someone who has a lot of different things going on in their world. They feel very supported by family, by friends, by a strong career. The life circumstances that you find yourself in will alter the response that you have to the drug. And we know that also from animal studies. So if you put an animal in an isolated little cage and there's nothing in the cage except emptiness, they're more likely to abuse drugs like heroin or alcohol. If the animal is in a fabulous cage with toys and fun treats like donuts and all kinds of friends, or sex partners, the animal might use some heroin, might use alcohol and try it in that environment, but it won't seem to develop addiction to those substances. And so the environment that you are in matters so much. And so we'll talk about that in the course. And laboratory studies have been incredibly helpful in delineating some of these non-pharmacological factors and how they are just as important as the pharmacological factor piece. Okay, so studying drug use, you can tell I'm already talking about studies. There's so many different ways that we can study drug use. Scientists from different perspectives really are needed to really understand this topic. Different levels of analysis. One scientist may be putting a microelectrode in the brain of a rat to measure dopamine levels. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter that changes for drug use and makes you feel better and euphoric and energetic. Whereas another scientist may be completely different. They're looking at the society level perspective, like, how is the poverty and isolation that this person feels contributing to the propensity for addiction? Okay, so those different levels of analysis require different skills, but they're so important. And, you might have one person who's a neuroscientist or a chemist or a biologist or even a psychologist who studies the biological perspective. They might look at the neuron side, whereas, people with very different backgrounds would be looking at the maybe society perspective, like public health, sociology, also psychologists. It's very interdisciplinary as a field. That's why I found it very appealing. I like to think about all the moving pieces, all the different disciplines that come in that help us understand this complex problem. And a lot of times it really is a field where you feel like the research that's done helps people in the end. So it's very translational in focus, where sometimes you're studying very basic things in the lab, in the bench, even in a chemistry setting, all the way up to helping a person in a clinical practice if they have a substance abuse problem. A lot of times we talk about this bench to bedside translational research program as, starting from animal studies, starting from very, low level, what is happening in the body when the drug is ingested in this particular system, all the way up to, how can we help humans? Can we develop medicines that help people to overcome their addiction to a certain substance? All those sorts of things. Can we develop programs that are in schools that would prevent adolescents from, developing serious problems with substances, things like that? Okay, so in this chapter, there's a lot about getting a little bit of information about what drugs are used, who uses them, and where they're used. And I'll just give you a couple of take-home messages. So first of all, what we know from around the world is that, countries differ, areas differ, all kinds of things differ, but there are some consistencies. Like a lot of times men will use more alcohol and drugs than women. So that's often found in studies and in different countries. Marijuana is the most commonly used illicit drug. High rates in the United States and New Zealand. So, you have countries very far away, but they have similar patterns. Alcohol use is highest in the Netherlands and lowest in Mexico. So you see that alcohol use will differ from country to country. Younger people use drugs more than older people. This is incredibly consistent. So drug use tends to begin in adolescence, it peaks in young adulthood, and it tends to decline over time. So that's very consistent. And then the other thing that we talk about in this chapter is a little bit about how drug laws play a role in use. And interestingly, countries that have very stringent drug laws tend not to have very low drug use. We don't spend an incredible amount of time in this course on drug policy. So if you wanted to take a course in drug policy, we have one in our department that Dr. Goddard teaches. So you can take that class, but we do touch on it a little bit in this course. Okay, so when did people use and when did they start to really have what we consider to be a problem? And the fact of the matter is that most of the time people are using drugs and they're really not developing serious concerns with them. So, we have lots of people who drink alcohol responsibly, for example. But there are a subset of people who develop drug-related problems. They can be very mild. They can be transient, where they develop over time and then it just kind of goes away. Circumstances change. Maybe someone starts drinking a little bit more when they lose their job, but once they get another job, things sort of return to normal. But sometimes, those mild problems escalate over time, and that escalation can be over a long period of time or a short period of time, and it can lead to just totally devastating consequences. And so obviously the most extreme is death. Some drugs that you use can lead to death. And so that's what we are always worried about. Chronic drug use also alters the way the brain is functioning. It alters the chemical levels, and it can be very difficult for the person to stop using because the body starts to compensate for the drug exposure, and then taking away the drug suddenly is, almost, something that can cause death. So for example, someone who uses alcohol excessively every single day, if they were to suddenly stop drinking, they could have extreme seizures and it could actually lead to death. It's very, very dangerous. And so that makes it very difficult for a person who has developed problematic drug use. So we really do want to avoid that. A lot of times when someone develops a problem, we are talking about the fact that they need the drug to feel normal. They don't feel normal if the drug isn't present. And that's one thing. And the other thing is that drugs are causing significant problems in the person's life. Relationship problems, difficulty maintaining a job, feeling depressed all the time. The list goes on. And we will talk about the different things that you might look for, but that is something to be concerned about. Okay, so just a little bit about how we classify drugs. So the Controlled Substances Act is used to regulate the manufacture and use and distribution of certain substances, and they're classified based on medical use and the potential for abuse. So there are different legal penalties depending on the drug, and we will talk about the differences in a second. It's not without controversy how this system works. So for example, marijuana is considered Schedule 1, the highest potential for abuse with no medical use. But as you know, that there are some good scientific studies for the medical use of marijuana. And so scientists, like many in the general public, have argued that we need to change the system as the way the scheduling system works as the science changes. So, but just a little bit of an overview, drugs will be on these 5 schedules. And Schedule 1 is the highest potential of abuse. Schedule 5 is lower potential of abuse. And, if someone doesn't really have a reason to use the drug for any medical reason, it's not safe. Heroin is, for example, on this Schedule 1, then you would have significant penalties if you did abuse, traffic that substance. And you can see that on this list, you go down in different schedules. And so, let's look at Schedule 4, for example. Lower potential of abuse, medical use is needed, but may lead to limited dependence. So some of the anti-anxiety medications like Valium, for example, would be Schedule 4. It could lead to some dependence. So we do need to watch the use of these drugs, but not as concerning as maybe Schedule 1, 2, or 3 drugs. And that's it for this mini lecture. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will get some feedback from you if you want to hear more from this chapter.